Thank you all for joining the webinar this evening, particularly on such a lovely night. My name is Matthew Jordan. I farm sheep and beef in just outside of Alnwick in Northumberland, but I'm also scientific officer for Regenerate Outcomes, who are hosting the webinar this evening. And so we're delighted to be joined by Alan Williams, Luke and Kyle from Understanding Ag, who are going to talk about rest, recovery and rooting depth, and also particularly pleased to be joined by a couple of farms that Regenerate's been working with for a couple of years now in just outside of Hexham in Northumberland. So we've got Ali Wardle and Sean Moore. So Regenerate Outcomes sponsors a mentoring program that draws on Understanding Ag's expertise, and we'll also have a suite of data monitoring and verification services to help farms earn additional revenues from things like carbon credits. But I'll pop a link to our website in the chat if you want more info or the ability to get in touch. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Alan Williams for the webinar this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate it, and welcome everybody. I'm going to go through a slide presentation to start, to sort of put us all on the same page and to make sure that we all understand the same basic foundations of regenerative grazing. And then I'm going to ask Sean and Ali to share their experiences with what they're doing on their individual farms. So I'm going to go ahead and do a share screen here. If I can get this to pop up. I've got a lag here, and I apologize for that. Okay. All right. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Not yet, Alan.
Not yet. Okay.
Nope.
Okay, it's let me go back to all right, let me try this one more time.
There you go.
Okay. So can you see the title slide?
Yeah, that's all good, Alan.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that delay. All right, so we're going to be talking today about rest, recovery, and optimizing rooting depth in our pastures for our grazing. Now, just very briefly, for those of you who may be joining us that are not familiar with Understanding Ag, we are a agricultural and food consulting company based here in the United States. We are comprised of actual farmers and ranchers and many others. We have consulted through the years, and this includes my own consulting experience and all of that, but with more than 4,500 farmers and ranchers, and with many other types of food companies, institutions, agencies, NGOs, and so forth. That includes consulting with many food and fiber companies that a lot of you would recognize, such as General Mills and Danone and Unilever, Mars Corporation, and so forth. We do currently have consulting staff in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the UK. And we've worked with farmers and ranchers in more than 42 different countries in all US states. And we're currently working across more than 33 million acres that are under regenerative transition. We do have to have a definition for regenerative agriculture. Some of you have heard this before, but I'll just share it again with you briefly. But this is our definition. And it is farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and the 4 ecosystem processes to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem function, starting with life within the soil and then expanding to life above. And that's probably within the last 8 decades of agriculture where we've made our biggest mistake, is ignoring the life underneath our feet, the life in the soils, in our pastures, in our fields. And we use what we call the 6-3-4 to effectively accomplish this. And I'll briefly describe what that is. But first, a couple of quotes here. One is, I love this quote from W.C. Loudermilk, where he says, "The land does not lie. It bears a record of what men write on it, a record that is easy to read by those who understand the simple language of the land." And we have found this to be very, very true. We can step foot on anybody's farm or ranch anywhere in the world and very quickly know basically how that land has been managed, not just very recently, but over the last several decades. And this is really what it's all about. It's about trying to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore as much life as we possibly can. And the other thing that we got to remember is we're actually in the hospitality business. If we're farming, if we're grazing, it's our job to provide a welcoming bed and breakfast to our guests. And who are those guests? Well, they're the biology that lives in and on the thin films of water that surround our aggregated soil. So here's the 6-3-4. Most of you have been exposed to this, so I'm not going to spend any time on this other than just to tell you what they are. And if you haven't been exposed to them prior, we have a lot of information on our website at understandingag.com that will help you to further understand exactly what these 6 principles and 3 rules are. Number 1, know your context. Number 2, minimize disturbance. And this is not only minimizing tillage disturbance or mechanical or chemical disturbance, but also minimizing disturbance through things like overgrazing or too frequent grazing. Number 3 is keeping our soil covered or armored. Number 4 is diversity. This is one of the things that we find to be significantly lacking for many farmers and grazers, frankly, the world over now. This is a global problem. Number 5, living roots in the soil. And number 6, integrating animals appropriately and properly whenever we can. And then the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship are, first, the rule of compounding, meaning that there never are any singular effects in nature. And when we think about rest, recovery, and rooting of plants, the concept of the rule of compounding is critically important there. Because if we do not give our pastures and our paddocks enough rest and recovery in between grazing events, and we do this repeatedly, what we are going to do is create a series of negative compounding and cascading effects. But if we properly implement the 6 principles and the 3 rules, and we give enough rest and recovery between grazing events, then we're doing the opposite. We're creating a series of positive compounding effects rather than negative. Then we have diversity again. We saw diversity as one of the principles. It's also one of the rules. And then the rule of disruption. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time tonight on the rule of disruption, because this is critical to helping us be able to achieve the rest and recovery and the rooting depth that we would like to see. And then we implement the 6 principles and the 3 rules to be able to optimize the 4 ecosystem processes. These are the things that are still free to us in agriculture and always will be. They are energy flow, photosynthesis, the water cycle, the mineral cycle, and once again, diversity. So you see, diversity is one of the principles, it's one of the rules, and it's one of the 4 ecosystem processes. So that's how critically important diversity is in what we do. unfortunately today, all four of these ecosystem processes have been heavily compromised in virtually every country that we've been in. So let's first think about recovery of a plant. Okay, recovery of a plant. And when we talk about recovery, what we're talking about is the time it takes a plant to physically and physiologically recover from a prior grazing event. Now, recovery and rest are not the same thing. Okay, they are not the same thing at all. And I'll define rest here in just a moment. But recovery, again, is just the point at which that plant has recovered physically and physiologically from the prior grazing event. And that's what we see here. Okay, so this slide does not depict proper rest. It just depicts recovery of the plant. So when, full recovery is when we have, 4 new leaves on that plant, and one of those leaves actually starting to brown a little bit. So that is actually full recovery from a prior grazing event. And what we have found is that for optimal animal performance over time, when we look at our grasses, and not including our forbs and our legumes, but just thinking about our grasses, ideal grazing time is when these grasses are in that boot stage, which you see depicted on the left, and very early heading stage. And here's why that is the ideal stage for animal performance. It hits the sweet spot between the balance of protein and energy that is being supplied to our cattle, our sheep, or whatever we are grazing. And so basically that means that the sweet spot for most of our grasses and grazing is going to be around that mid-maturity stage and not early maturity. And the vast majority of us have been taught probably our entire lives that we really need to focus on keeping things at an early maturity stage or highly, highly vegetative. And the fact of the matter is we are actually providing an imbalanced diet to our livestock when that is the case. We have way too much protein relative to the amount of energy and even other minerals that are in that forage at that particular point in time. Now, if we think about plant rest is the period of time required after a grazing event recovery, and we defined recovery earlier, that is needed to do this list of things here. So it is needed to recharge the soil microbial population, to allow for new seed bank responses to occur, in other words, greater diversity to show itself, to build additional root biomass and depth. So if all we're doing is plant recovery and we're not also incorporating plant rest on top of the recovery period, then we're going to have a very hard time recharging the microbial population in the soil, at building additional rooting depth and biomass, and at achieving any level of diversity in our plant species. This rest period also allows us to better achieve our production and financial goals and objectives, to build new biodiversity out there. And this is biodiversity in plant species, microbial species in the soil, beneficial insects, birds, and so forth. And it also allows us to build a much stronger phytonutrient profile in the plants that we are expecting our livestock to graze and to take advantage of. And the work that we've been doing with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet and his team of researchers shows us very clearly that when we combine recovery with additional rest, we are absolutely building a far better phytonutrient profile, and our animals and us benefit tremendously from that. So we achieve this through adaptive grazing. And adaptive grazing is very simply a form of grazing that allows us to be fully adaptable and flexible to our ever-changing conditions. It produces the greatest results in the shortest period of time. There's a number of us that have been implementing adaptive grazing in some form or fashion for several decades now, and we have not yet hit a threshold. Every other form of grazing conceivable, we typically tend to hit a threshold that we in our progress stops. But we haven't found that to be the case yet with adaptive grazing. So it allows continuous incremental progress, and it allows us to achieve the highest levels of profitability. Now, if we look at both a cropping and a grazing situation, when we look at a cropping situation, when we are not implementing cover crops and livestock, we have far less biological activity and diversity occurring, and the soil function is minimized. However, as we move along the continuum and we add in strategic cover cropping, livestock impact on those cover crops, then we see significant explosions in life both beneath and above the soil surface. The same thing in our grazing. So as we move from continuous grazing to a typical rotation to adaptive grazing, we see life exploding both beneath and above that soil surface. And then the other benefits that we see as we move from continuous grazing to adaptive grazing is far better distribution and utilization of the manure and urine coming from our livestock. So this is important to us as well, because this provides ongoing fertility impact. When we have more of a continuous grazing or even a slow rotation, then we see that the vast majority of the manure and urine that our livestock are depositing is being deposited around water and shade and not evenly distributed through our pastures and paddocks. So what we're really trying to achieve here is a fully functioning carbon cycle, and we're doing this by simulating nature. This is a video of some of our cattle that were grass finishing at our farm in Alabama. And so this is 600 head of grass fats being moved from one paddock to another, a single strand of polywire. What I want you to notice, besides the ease of movement of the cattle on a daily basis, are all the birds. We have very large flocks of birds that follow these cattle on a daily basis. And that's because of the tremendous number of insects that we have now due to the incredible plant species diversity and biomass. So we see the birds taking advantage of those insects that are stirred up by the daily and even multi-daily moves of the cattle. And then this is an idea of some of the stock densities that we have these grass finishers under. We'll go anywhere from about 100,000 pounds per acre to over 500,000 pounds per acre with multi-times a day moves. And again, the three rules of adaptive stewardship, compounding, diversity, disruption. No matter what species we are grazing, these three rules apply, period, bottom line. So again, on the rule of compounding, we just need to recognize compounding effects are always occurring and that they're never neutral, either positive or negative. So the decisions that we make a big difference in terms of how this is impacted. And then in terms of the rule of diversity, we do want as much diversity and complexity as possible. And why do we want that? Because it produces very positive compounding and cascading effects. We get much stronger phytonutrient components, and we also get requisite diversity in microbial species and microorganisms. This is, again, a video from our farm in Alabama, and you can see all the diversity in plant species out there. You can hear the insects, and you can see a lot of different birds. that are appearing and following the cattle. Believe it or not, there's more than 700 head of cattle there in that pasture, but they're very hard to see because of the height of the grass that is in there. So the grass is in a lot of places even over the height of the hips and the shoulders of the cattle. So we have documented now, by implementing adaptive practices with proper recovery and rest periods, we have documented more than 150 different plant species in our pastures. And we have also documented our livestock, our cattle and our sheep, our pigs, our chickens, eating every single one of these 150 plus plant species. So this is making a dramatic difference in the health of our livestock and the productivity of our livestock and in our net profitability. And then ultimately, and we do have this documented well, the phytonutrient profile of the end products, our meat, our eggs, and so forth. So finally, the rule of disruption, and this is where the rubber meets the road in being able to achieve the proper recovery and rest and rooting depth that we want to achieve. By implementing planned, purposeful disruptions. We have to remember that nature has tremendous resilience and responds very well to challenges. But if we don't introduce challenges and we're sort of in a prescriptive or formulaic mindset about the way we graze, then nature is going to just sort of do nothing, okay? And it's not going to improve itself. Think about the rule of disruption this way. For any of you that have been athletes in your life, you know that to be a highly successful athlete, highly competitive, that you cannot do the same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity over and over again. If you do, you're going to hit a wall and you're going to stop making progress. The only way that you continue to make progress as an athlete is by introducing planned, purposeful disruptions to your exercise routine. And you got to keep doing that to keep making progress. Well, if that works with our biology, and we are biology, then it also works with all of the biology that we deal with on our farms, from the soil biology to the plants, to the animals, to the insects, and so forth. So how do we introduce planned, purposeful disruptions? Well, first and foremost, stop doing things the same way every time. Intentionally do things differently. Adaptive management is not a routine, a recipe, or a formula. So what are some of the ways we can be disruptive as a grazer? Well, number one, alter stock densities. Number two, alter our rotational patterns. This is a big mistake way too many of us make. We start off in the spring every year, basically in the same pasture, and then we have the same rotational pattern around our farms year after year after year. So let's alter those rotation patterns, alter grazing heights on and off. And here we go, alter rest periods. This is critical, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in a moment. If you're multi-species, cattle, sheep, maybe other species as well, like we are, then alter the species order from time to time. Alter the time of season or year a paddock is grazed, and even the total number of days that a paddock is grazed throughout that year. Here's another really big one, and it can make a profound positive impact. Alter the shape of the paddock configuration, and even paddock direction. Then we can do things like bale grazing or planned burns, implement a leader-follower concept. Many of you have contours, having been there last year, the vast majority of the farms that we visited, you've got quite a bit of contour on your farms. So implementing contour grazing, where we're building paddocks and moving our livestock with the contours rather than building paddocks up and down that contour. We follow the contour with the paddocks and move from low to high with contour grazing. And then we can implement combinations of these disruptions. So let me give you an example. So I can, in a single grazing disruptive event, I can alter stock densities, I can alter my rest period, and I can alter my paddock configuration. So I can introduce 3 disruptions in the same disruptive event. And that produces even faster progress for us. This is a video of one of our dairy grazers located in the state of Minnesota. So they're in a more cold environment versus what I'm located here in the deep south of the U.S. He's moving his cows an average of 4 to 6 times a day in between milkings and achieving tremendous results doing this. He has built incredible diversity, perennial diversity in his pastures without planting it. The vast majority volunteered from the latent seed bank, but it's doing this because he radically altered the recovery and rest periods, as well as introducing other disruptions. In his prior life as a dairy farmer, and this is Derek Smith, he was averaging moving his cattle on grazing rotations every 18 to 25 days. And then he was back in the same prior grazed paddock. And what he was finding was that his performance continued to decline without continuous added inputs. And his milk components would drop over time pretty rapidly. He had lower lifetime lactations out of these cows, and the degree of diversity in his plant species in his pastures continued to drop. It was only when he made the direct decision to radically increase his recovery and rest periods that everything began to improve. This is another one of our clients out in Texas. What you're looking at in this video are 5,300 head in a single mob that are being moved under a single strand of polywire 4 to 6 times a day. So again, 5,300 head, 2 people constructing paddocks and moving more than 5,000 head a day, 4 to 6 times a day. And they have had incredible results, very positive results from doing this. And this concept has allowed them to greatly lengthen their recovery and rest periods. And that has resulted in a dramatic increase in plant species diversity and livestock performance and net profitability. This is at a dairy in eastern Pennsylvania, and they hosted a soil health academy last year. So one of the things that we did for the benefit of the dairy farmer and the academy, I had them build an exclusion paddock where they agreed to not graze it at all for the entire year until we held the academy in September. And you're looking at what the paddock looked like after that exclusion, not grazing it at all for 9 months. And you see tremendous growth, but many of you probably are also looking at these pictures and thinking, well, that's a lot of old. I see a lot of brown material, looks like maybe some dead material. So that's probably no good anymore. And that was probably a big mistake. It's too old, too lignified. It's worthless. Why would you tell them to do that? You know, and I'll have to be honest with you, these same dairy farmers, as they were going through this process before the academy, they would call me up month after month and say, wow, this is really getting mature. And should we just go ahead and mow it or graze it? And I said, no, do nothing with it. Wait until the academy. And so they did. They held out. They waited until the academy. And during the academy, we measured a number of things. And here is what we found. Okay. So in the same field, the same pasture, that we put this exclusion paddock in the middle of that field, not on an edge, but in the middle. And that was very purposeful. And they grazed like they normally do in their normal rotations, about every 25 to 30 days, the paddocks on either side of this exclusion paddock. Well, when we measured it in September after 9 months of not grazing at all, we actually found that counting the biomass production in the other paddocks that they grazed what they considered to be normally, this paddock had produced more than 3.5 times the biomass production over and above the other paddocks that were not excluded. In the normally grazed paddocks, the plant bricks averaged 10%. In this paddock, as it appears in September, as you're looking at it in this picture here, averaged 15%. That blew their minds. They did not believe at all that this would actually have a higher bricks content than the more routinely grazed paddocks, which were much more vegetative in appearance. They thought that this would be far, far lower bricks. When we stuck a shovel in the ground, we found that the degree of soil aggregation and biological activity was far higher here than it was in the paddocks on either side. And even the individual plant species morphology was distinctly different and better. The plant leaf material here, the leaves were wider, bigger, and more velvety to the touch than the exact same plant species in the normally grazed paddocks on either side. And we actually documented in just 9 months, they had added 6 more plant species varieties that had not shown up from their seed bank before in just this 9 months of exclusion. Now, that was last year. This year, they're grazing that paddock, but they are giving it longer than 30-day rest periods. They're going 45 to 50 days. And they said, and they're telling me that this year, every time their lactating cows are on this particular paddock that we did the exclusion on last year, their milk components and fluid milk production goes up every time. And they've grazed it, I think, 2 or 3 times so far this year. And they're seeing those positive benefits continue. Here's one thing I want you to understand, and this is very important. So sort of burn this into your memory. In work that has been done by some colleagues of ours, Dr. Richard Teague and his co-workers, what we have found is that when you allow your livestock to graze in a single grazing event, to graze up to 50% of the leaf volume of that plant, you have no more than a 2 to 4% root growth stoppage. But now let's take a look at what happens when you allow them to take just 10 more percent. Now, to our eyes, we think, well, that's nothing. That cannot possibly change anything. But the research and the results tell us otherwise. So if we go up to 60%, all of a sudden we jump way up to 50% root growth stoppage. And if we allow them to take up to 80% of what's out there, then we jump all the way to 100% root growth stoppage for a period of time. And let's see how that impacts the recovery and then the rest period. So scenario A up there is what I would consider a more conventional or set stock grazing pattern, where we allow them to come in and just, take our plants down fairly short. And let's take a look at what happens. When we do that, then look at what happens beneath the soil surface as well. We're getting negative compounding effects. We are losing living root biomass. That means we're losing functional microbial activity. So they're no longer cycling nutrients to feed to the plant because they're lacking food from the plant in the form of root exudates. Our soil temperature is now heating up. So we're losing soil moisture. We haven't left enough plant leaf material for proper photosynthetic activity to occur. So the recovery takes a lot longer, both above and beneath the soil surface. But if we graze more properly and then move forward, then we can see that recovery, we do very little damage beneath and above the soil. we have positive compounding effects, and recovery occurs much more rapidly. And you can see here in some additional research that's been done. Now here they were cutting to simulate grazing. And I'll tell you, mowing does not adequately simulate grazing. This would have been even better if this would have been grazed versus mowed. But you can see the difference in cutting every week versus every 2 weeks versus every 4 weeks in the root biomass and rooting depth. And why another reason this is important is because a large percentage of our organic matter increase will come from the root biomass and rooting depth. So if we want to build more organic matter and carbon, we've got to put roots deeper into the ground, and we've got to put more total root biomass into that soil. This also, as we do that, that helps us to optimize our soil microbial habitat. And this is crucial for those microbes feeding back nutrients to our plants so our plants will thrive and have a higher nutrient density component to them. And you'll notice in this depiction here that there are different plant species. Now, you can see that there's different architecture of these plants, different heights, different leaf structure and shape and all of that above the soil surface when we have different plant species. But what about beneath the soil surface? Does that difference in depth and biomass and root architecture hold true to the differences in plant shoot biomass that we see above the soil? Absolutely. So just like it's important above the soil surface to have plant diversity, it's every bit as important beneath the soil surface, because you can see the tremendous diversity in the root biomass and depth and architecture beneath the soil surface. Here is another depiction of how deep we can actually get these roots to go into the soil in perennial systems if we apply the appropriate recovery and then rest. And again, here you can see a monoculture system on the right, and look at the very shallow rooting depth and the lack of root biomass compared to a perennial system on the left, where we have far, far greater root development, both in biomass and depth. This is from one of our clients in the state of Colorado. This is a picture of when we first started working with them, and they were overgrazing and returning too soon after grazing events. And it was, in essence, sort of desertifying the ranch. So one of the things, and they were continuous grazing, set stock grazing. So we implemented adaptive grazing principles and practices, which incorporated longer rest periods. And then this is what that exact same area looked like after less than a year of allowing additional rest. So it responded dramatically and very prolifically. This is in New Zealand with a client I've been working with in helping them to rebuild and restore their pastures. They had been management intensive, or what we might call MIG grazers, for more than 3 decades. And so they were very, very good MIG grazers. You know, they followed that prescription to the T. But they called me up very frustrated that the performance in their sheep was declining. The performance of the pastures was declining, and they couldn't figure out why. And so I asked them what they were doing, and they said, well, we're MIG grazing. And I said, well, are you ever changing anything up, or are you, pretty much doing the same thing every day and every year? And they said, well, yeah, that's the formula. That's what we're told to follow. And I said, well, that's why you've hit a wall. That's exactly what's happened. So we started implementing adaptive grazing strategies. And that's what you see on the picture on the right, using a combination of disruptions, including much higher stock densities and longer rest periods. And they radically altered in less than a year They were very, very pleased with the results that they were seeing. So again, we've got to focus on not just that recovery, but also rest. And I'm going to finish up with this and then go to Sean and Allie so they can describe what they're doing. But one of the primary reasons we do this in terms of extending recovery and rest periods is to dramatically improve the microbial population underneath the soil. Now, take a look at this plant. The actual roots are the darker roots that you see concentrated in the middle of that picture. But everything extending from those, the much lighter colored things that appear to be roots are not roots, that's mycorrhizal fungi. So as we build mycorrhizal populations, we greatly extend the reach of each individual plant's roots, and that's exactly what we want to happen. But here's what's happening inside that plant root, and this is also critically important. That mycorrhizal fungi actually penetrates into the root of that plant. It first penetrates through that outer root layer, the epidermis, then into the outer cortex of the root, and then finally into the inner cortex, where it forms the arbuscular components. That's why we often call it arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And this is the system through which the mycorrhizal fungi grab nutrients in the soil and feed them directly to the plant root. So what do mycorrhizal fungi do? Well, they're far better than the plant roots themselves at capturing nutrients into the soil, and 6 to 10 times better, as a matter of fact, than the plant roots themselves. Number two, they produce very powerful enzymes that solubilize bound nutrients in the soil so that plants can then take those minerals up as a nutrient. The mycorrhizal system extends the reach of every individual plant's roots from 40 to 60 centimeters. The mycorrhizal fungi increase the absorptive surface area of a plant root from several hundred to more than 1,000 times. They interconnect the roots of all plant species growing in the field, and they transfer from one area of a field to another primary and secondary nutrients from plant to plant to plant. They can even absorb and pick up amino acids, which is an organic form of nitrogen in the soil, to then feed to the plant roots. They're able to mobilize many different minerals in the soil to feed to the plants. They actually preserve and supply water to these plants in periods of drought, and they are nature's principal immune system against fungal disease. This is a picture of mycorrhizal fungi transferring nitrogen from the soil in the form of amino acids into a plant root. So you see them taking this nitrogen out of the soil and putting it right into the inner cortex of that plant root. This is a picture of water molecules inside a plant root that were placed there by mycorrhizal fungi. Last year in the UK, you got hot, you got dry. This is the power of mycorrhizal fungi. They can literally place water molecules into your plant roots to be stored there to then be utilized by that plant when it turns hot and it turns dry. So that plant has greater resilience. And then this is a video of mycorrhizal fungi transporting carbon through the soil. So look at how rapidly carbon and nutrients are moved through the mycorrhizal fungi. That's why the mycorrhizal fungi are the original World Wide Web, the original internet beneath the soil surface, the original superhighway beneath the soil surface. So we want to use all of our senses of observation, sight, sound, smell, touch, and even taste, so that we can make far better decisions in what we do. And again, to restore far more diversity of life. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over. Sean, I'll ask you to go first and to share with everybody what you're doing, and then Allie after that. So Sean, please tell us what you're doing and what you've learned so far.
Right. Hello. My name's Sean Moore. Farm just above Hexham. Beef, sheep, and arable. Started beginning of 2019. Started copying the New Zealand way for a few months, and my idea was to up the stock numbers and then, rotational graze like that. But when I started doing it, I started seeing what the grass could do on its own. There was no need for fertilizer or anything. So then I started heading down the mob grazing route, and just seeing what I can do with no inputs, rather than going chasing the stock around with fertilizer to grow for the next rotation. It does seems to work quite well. The sheep, each individual sheep's performance probably no better than loose rotation or set stocking, but you can carry more sheep to the acre, so you can make a bit more money that way. The cattle take to it particularly well. It seems to be with cattle, as long as they can wrap their tongues around it and get a big mouthful, they don't really mind what it is too much, and they did take to it well. I'll just see if I can. How do I share?
Yeah, there's a green share screen button at the bottom. And the bottom, if you hover your arrow over it.
I'm just on an iPhone.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, no, I've maybe found it. Yeah, found it. Photos. Right. Right. So this photo here. This was just a few months after I started, and started.
It hasn't shared yet, Sean.
Oh, right. Wait a minute. Has that worked?
Not yet.
There
we go. Now it's right. Okay. There we go.
That was a few months after I started, when I'd started listening to podcasts about mob grazing and that sort of thing. And the cows took to it straight away. There was no hassle training them or anything. And then I wish I was better at this. And then the sheep, their hard work. Yeah, I can. I can make tall grass grazing work pretty well with sheep up to a point, and then it we can get up to about that, up until the grass is heading, and then the performance starts to going down. So what we tend to find with the sheep is keep upping the densities as the grass is growing well through spring. And then once it gets to the beginning of June, if I keep the high density, then they aren't, because they eat very little of it to do well on it. So they go from at the start of spring to eating half a plant, to by June they're maybe only eating 20% of it. And it tends to, if I keep the density too high after that, they lose performance, because there isn't enough for them to get the nice stuff, instead of trying to make them eat too much of it. Although one thing you do get with sheep is they are pretty good at paddling stuff down. You can get quite a lot of stuff down onto the ground. That's just after sheep had been in for about a quarter of an hour or something like that, and for getting plants down, they are pretty good. although they don't mash the plant into the ground. They sort of lie it down like a thatch, whereas cattle tend to mash it into the ground a bit more. And the two different ways of working it between the two of them. And by swapping cattle and sheep in fields between one rotation and the next, I do tend to find they'll do two different jobs and do it, and both are pretty advantageous. But if anything, I would say the cattle do a better job of stuff. For cattle putting stuff down into the ground, where are we? I did a bit of a sequence here. This was just after they'd been in, a couple of hours after they'd gone out. They'd put a lot right down into the ground. And then one thing I do like about adaptive grazing is, for all it looks bad when you've left it down like that, over time it actually comes back stronger, and tend to get better results later. So with the first couple of weeks after you've grazed it, it looks pretty poor. But then actually, I'll take that one off. And that is about 3 or 4 or 5 days after the clover's starting to come through, but the rest of it looks pretty dead. But all the dead grass all the grass that was paddled down, it soon disappears. You know, it doesn't sit around spoiling the sward. It soon gets into the ground. That's in the same field. Maybe a week later, and there's young grasses starting to come through, and then this is the same field. Where are we? If I can find it. That is that's about a fortnight later, and it's coming up lots of nice young fresh grasses there. And that's one way I can kind of use the cattle to keep the quality in the grass for the sheep later on in the season, because just sheep on their own, you struggle to get the nice regrowth, nice total regrowth like that, to have a bit of quality for getting the lambs to do. Like there is epigenetics in that, but I still find to a point that sheep do need reasonable quality grass to do well. And anytime I've tried to make them go on to 2-rank stuff, I tend to find the performance drops off a cliff a bit. Whereas if I can keep a proportion of the ground like that coming through, and then maybe 5 or 6 weeks after cows have been through, the sheep can go onto it and do quite well at it. Not that I get it right all the time at all. What else am I finding? With calving cows, I do it in the paddock now. That was last spring on some rough ground that went into the winter with a fair cover on it, and then I was calving cows on it the following spring, mostly dead grass, but they did fairly well on it. It was a nice clean place for calves to be born, and I do like calving in paddocks. I can't get away with lambing in paddocks. Lambing only works set stocking for me. So some fields get put aside, lambed in, and then lambs left to get a few weeks old, 2 or 3 weeks old, before they're put back onto rotation again. They just seem to like their own space, whereas cattle seem to be a bit more, what's the word for it? A bit more social. And if one cow's calving, the rest of them will leave her alone when she needs leaving alone, or they'll go and say hello to it when it's born. They seem to take to it better. Cattle, which what's happened there? Which goes all the way through. Cattle respect fences better. Sheep, if fence is switched off for half an hour, they're all out. If fence is switched off for a day, they quite often don't notice. One thing I have noticed, it used to be that in a hard winter, the grass used to grow better the following summer, whereas with a mild winter, the grass was pretty rubbish the following summer. And what I think was happening was under set stocking with a mild winter, the grass kept trying to grow and the sheep kept nibbling it off. Whereas now, like through winter, we call winter 7 months long, each piece of ground's only grazed for 1 day through that 7 months, and the rest of the 7 months it's recovering. And you can go into spring with a fair bit of cover on the first fields that were grazed through the winter, and it's ready to go. Whereas under the old system, the grass was quite tired, and it took a month or two for it to really set off again, even after it warmed up. Whereas now there's plenty of leaf ready to catch the sunlight as it comes. This spring, cold and wet, very wet. And the grass didn't particularly grow much, but because for a fair proportion of the farm there was nothing on it and a fair bit of cover, on the odd days when it did get a bit warmer, it grew. And because there was a fair proportion of the farm growing instead of none of it growing very much, it meant that the grass still managed to keep up with stuff. And then when it dried up a bit and warmed up a bit, it managed to get ahead. But there's I do think there's a lot to be said for having a bit of leaf ready to catch any sunlight that does come. But it's not that it's all good or all plain sailing, like, but it does seem to work that bit. I did have a couple more for cat pine. What else was I going to say? Yeah, I think that's about it. Don't think I've got much more to add. Feel free to ask any questions, anybody. I might make more sense if I'm answering a question rather than trying to preach.
Well, thank you, Sean. And yes, we are going to open this up to Q&A. And I'm going to ask Allie to share with everybody what they are doing and their observations, and then we will open this up to Q&A.
Hello everyone, I'm Alistair Wardle from just west of Hexham. Mixed farm, beef, sheep, a little bit arable. Originally I played with the arable side for longer than the grazing. I've just sort of started with that, so Sean's a lot further ahead than I am. Really started last year. I found this, how do you start doing it? And I can't remember if it was Alan or one of the Gabe or one of the others that said, well, just start somewhere, put them all together. So last spring after lambing time, I just pushed all the sheep in one field along with the cattle and sort of hoped it would be all right. And I grazed by field. I haven't got the electric fence and the water bit set. I'm getting closer. And last year I got to around 30-day rest period. And noticed quite a few different forms, especially coming back into the rested fields. I played a little bit with herbal lays the year prior to that, and there was I think it was just the year, there was a noticeable difference last year with the lack of insects. The year before, we had a colossal amount of butterflies and bees on the first herbal lay, the first year of herbal lay. And last year, although I've had, I put in 15 acres last year. So it was a more mixed herbal lay, lots of flowers, but there was less insects. And I think that was just the way the year was. This year again, I've got more herbal lays in, and they seem to be working well. Silage wise, last year I bottled it and I put a little bit of fertilizer on. I don't think I needed to, because it still performed a lot better than the silage fields that was still traditional grasses and a little bit of clover. So this year I didn't put any fertilizer on, and it performed well on the, we've made a little bit here so far, haven't in the silage. We're farming 2 different farms, separate blocks. The fell near the buildings where the farm is, I've grazed through lambing time, and the cows went out and I've rotationally grazed that. The fell away from the stem, the sheep would come off that in February, and it's had nothing on it until last week. The cows went up there, and they went into probably 2 foot deep. It's not a very diverse fell. The ones over this side are more diverse, but there is small patches of different species coming in. One thing or 2 things is noticeable: a lot of butterflies and moths. When you drive through the bike, there's just clouds of white moths, and there's a minute meadow browns. There's dozens and dozens of them. And the other thing I remember as a kid, grasshoppers. Very common. You heard grasshoppers. I remember summers were always hot when you were a child, and there was always lots of grasshoppers. And in the fell the cows had just gone into, I've accidentally come across 3 grasshoppers without looking. They appear to be quite numerous as well with the longer grasses. It would be better grazed with electric fences. It's just they've gone in just into the fields again, because I'm not set up for the electric fences, but the grazing the nicer bits, the electric fences would be good to force them to graze the whole field. But it's just something we're working on. You can't do everything in the first day. What else have I noticed? Yeah, increase of birds. I think I say insects. I hope this year is going to be better than last year was, and it's looking like it now with the number of butterflies that I've seen so far. Yeah, just I really like seeing the increase in the birds and the plants, and it's interesting to watch. So that's sort of where I am now. If that is a good enough description for you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So we really appreciate both of you sharing. And I'll make a couple of comments, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. One is, remember that this is adaptive grazing. So for each of you out there, the tendency that most people have when they hear about, well, move them more frequently, give a longer rest period, change stock density, is to pick a rest period, or to pick a stock density, or to pick a certain size paddock, and then to make that prescriptive. So that this is very much based on your daily observations and adjusting based on those observations. Again, that's why it's called adaptive grazing. So you heard Sean talk about, some of the challenges that he has experienced with the sheep, and some of the things that he can get the cows to do that he's not getting the sheep to do yet, right? And he's making adjustments for the sheep. Well, that's being adaptive. And so, Sean, you're doing what you need to do right now within your current context. There's nothing wrong with that. You're being adaptive. And Allie, and listening to what you were talking about, you're being adaptive. Now, what is happening is both of you have made some changes. You're introducing planned purposeful disruptions. You're seeing increases in plant species diversity. You're seeing more insects, you're seeing more birds, and you're seeing differences in the behavior of your livestock. So again, all of these things are to be expected. And one of the things that you're going to continue to find is that as you continue to grow the biology in the soil and to grow the plant species diversity, some of the things that may be an issue or a challenge today will no longer be an issue or a challenge because of the greater diversity and the greater microbial population in the soil. So over time, a lot of these things that we think are just continuous challenges gradually go away. So I'm going to go to the questions now. The first one I see says, Sean, how long of a rest do you give your cattle after grazing before you bring them back to the same paddock?
Very, very variable. It can be as little as 3 weeks or a month if I have to sacrifice the grass in one field to give another field a break. I had a field of seeds what got a light grazing in December. The cows are only back into it now, so that's like 7 months. It can be anywhere in between. Normally a couple of months, or it tends to be they gets to a point where you need the grass, so they have to go somewhere and they go there. Odd little bits of ground I'll let have a long recovery, or a long rest, should I say. Recovery is the same time. Although what I have been doing tends to be the worst bits of ground, I give the longest recovery to the longest rest to bring it forward. But what I might start doing is let the best bits of ground have a longer rest, and try and get some like little hotspots of stuff doing well. You tend to find that the time coming back into a field automatically changes a lot, because you might be 3/4 away across a field, and then say you start lambing or something like that, so there'll be a bit of grass left, and then automatically half of the fields had, or a quarter of the fields had, a lot longer rest than what the other part has. So the whole farm turns into a bit of checkerboard of some stuff. Might have had 2 or 3 grazings over 4 months, and then other stuff, other parts might have only had 1 grazing over the 4 months, and it makes it very hard to give an answer to what the recovery is. I do quite like, can't always do it. It depends, because the sheep have to kind of go to where the quality is. There's too many times I've lost the growth rates, but I do like it if you get sheep and then a long rest, and then cows, and then a rest, and then sheep back in, because from a parasite's point of view, it means that you've, for one thing, the long rest helps, but then it's been cleaned up with cows, and then it's another long rest before the sheep go back in, and all of a sudden it means that worms and fluke tend to not really be a problem anymore. I do think it's harder for people who only have one species to get quite the same benefit from that. That's about it, really.
So, Sean, that, as a matter of fact, that's what we would see and would anticipate, is that, the rest periods are going to be variable, because, if you were to have answered, well, now everything's getting a 50-day rest, and I'm always coming back after 50 days to every paddock, then you would be falling back into the same old prescriptive mindset, right? So what you're doing is you're making observations, and you're using those observations to help you determine when to go back to a previously grazed paddock. And that's precisely what we anticipate, is going to be happening. One of the things that we have found that helps a lot on the sheep is, to some of you may think, no way I'm ever going to do this, but a lot of times we'll put sheep and cattle together and move them together and graze them together. Now, we don't do it while they're lambing, but we do it at other periods of time. And we find that we can use a single strand of polywire set at the height of the cattle, and the sheep actually like to stay with the cattle. So that may be something that some of you want to give a go and try it some period of time. It has been successful for us. And then, Sean, another thing you mentioned, following the cattle with the sheep, or the sheep with the cattle, they are dead-end hosts to each other's primary parasites, internal parasites. So when you do that, you are breaking that parasite cycle, both in the cattle and in the sheep. So that's very helpful as well. So, Allie, anything to add on your end about your rest periods or what you're seeing?
No, I don't think so. Just something else that I've missed. I've locked up one field, 3 acre, just a little close. It's been locked up since all year, and it'd be just your comment about that. I think it was a dairy farmer that had done that, and sort of it'd be interesting to see what this little close does. Sort of leave it till the end of the year. We'll have a discussion likely to see how far you think we should go with that one, but it'll be interesting to see what happens then and what happens to it next year. What other species have perhaps appeared, and it's just, yeah, it's enjoyable watching it change. And sort of when you, again, I'm just doing it on fields, but you go in to a field and the sheep have decided that they want to move that day. So you know when they want to go, because you go to the gate and they've all come to the gate ready to go through. So it's interesting observation. It puts a smile on your face. That's it.
I love what you just said, and you're exactly right. And Allie, I've been doing this for a long time now, 30 years or so. And I can tell you, every single time I move sheep or cattle or whatever, it still puts a smile on my face.
Yeah, you know exactly when they want to move.
Exactly. They dang sure do. And, you know, if everyone remembers that video I showed of the 5,300 head that were being moved 4 to 6 times a day, every day of cattle, that's the Birdwell and Clark Ranch out in Texas. That is an incredible sight to see. We actually did 2 weeks ago, we did a 2-day workshop out there, and we had a lot of ranchers that were there observing that. And you should have seen the smile on the faces of all of those ranchers. They had never seen that before. And it was just amazing to them. But the other thing that was amazing, going back to your comment, Allie, about the contentment was those other ranchers were incredulous about the degree of contentment in those calves out there at the Birdwell Clark that were being moved daily. So it does matter. It does make a difference. Other questions, we are open to questions or comments, and you can either type them in or feel free to unmute yourself and to ask the question live. Either way.
Alan, I was going to make a quick comment real quick.
Please do.
Just
Yes,
based
sir.
off the presentation here. So I recognize a few names on here from some work we've been doing over there. And some of the questions I remember getting is people are worried about this rest and recovery and letting some of these plants get too mature and worried about their livestock performance dropping off. But yeah, I think of Derek's video that you showed of his cattle movements. He talked about contentment too. So the same class of livestock that he's always raised changed his grazing for system, kept this class of livestock. Some fall out, probably, yeah, but some of them he was able to select for the epigenetic benefits there. So I'd like for you to just touch on, you don't have to completely change your whole herd or flock to fit this system, but start to select and don't worry about the quality. Let the livestock speak for themselves and make some decisions based off of that. But I just think of some things, the compounding benefits that happen from being adaptive there. But if you would touch on that, I think the videos really showed that. And I appreciate Allie and Sean too, bringing their context and observations to the table too. It was really neat to hear some of those. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Luke. So yes, first and foremost, what we have found is that when we implement really good adaptive grazing practices, it separates the good ones from the bad ones fairly quickly. When we've been grazing more conventionally and supplementing, and I call it crutching animals up, propping them up through our supplements or amendments or whatever, then you're really sort of disguising the poor animals, the animals that can't really make it on their own. and given them an excuse. But when you switch to adaptive grazing, you very quickly uncover those genetics and epigenetics that aren't the best. And it allows you to be able to cull them out of the herd, cull them out of the flock. And in a fairly short period of time, in just 3 to 4 years, you develop herds and flocks that are almost trouble-free and require very little external input, amendments, supplements, whatever, to thrive and to perform. So that's one thing. And salute that's an excellent point. The other thing that we have found, though, again, going back to plant species diversity, is that as you continue to increase the species diversity of what's growing out there, then what they have to select from on a daily basis in their diet dramatically increases and improves. And yeah, you may have some plant species that have gone a little mature, but you've got many others that are at a perfect stage for them to forage on. So added diversity really sort of mitigates the issues that you have when you have much lower diversity. And if it's much lower diversity, then practically everything's mature or over mature at the same time. But that problem goes away as you increase diversity. I do see some additional questions here now. All right, so this one is, can you say a bit more about the use of herbal lays? What did you sow and how did it evolve over time? Is that fitting in with an arable rotation? So, Ali, you talked about the use of some herbal lays. So would you address that question from your perspective?
I guess it was 3 years ago we started, and I did a herbal lay that was quite high in red clover. I just had some cocksfoot and some diverse-wise, it wasn't as diverse as the ones I put in now. And I'm sort of aiming for, like I say, I haven't got there yet. I'm aiming for sort of 4 or 5 years before going back into corn. It yields very well. Last year, on 30 units of nitrogen, which I don't think I didn't need to add, I got 14 bales of silage an acre, which I was quite chuffed with. I'm getting the years right. Last year, the year before last, we put in 15 acres of herbal lay, and it had about 6 or 7 different varieties of grass, cocksfoot, ryegrass, fescues, timothy, Yorkshire fog. There's 4 species that we'll look for by 3LM, and that was one of them. It was an odd one to put in the seed versions, but like, do you really want to go down that route? But I quite like the idea of just, well, put it in, see what happens. And it's growing nicely in there. And then sort of burnet forage, burstfoot trefoil, ribgrass, chicory, sheep's parsley, yarrow. What else have we got in here? Sandfoin. Sandfoin didn't work. It likes a lighter soil, but I thought I'd try it, but it doesn't work up here. Then red clover, sweet clover, white clover, all side clover. So quite a mix of both grasses, forbs, and legumes. It's really nice to go into. So the chicory gets to about 6 foot tall. The field we put in, about 15 acre, it was interesting that it had different levels within it. Like normal silage field is maybe 2 foot of solid grass. This was like you could see nearly down to the bottom, and you could see all the different plants, different sort of levels within the lay. And I didn't put a lot of nitrogen onto it. And it yielded about the same as a normal silage field, which was quite a surprise to myself. I've walked through it, and the contractor hadn't really come across something like that, which was quite amusing. how it fits into the arable rotation, going back to the question. I don't know yet because I haven't got there. I direct drill. It'll be interesting to see how the transfers from the grass herbal mix into the arable. Gabe had mentioned it was maybe it's better to kill it off in the summer, put a cover crop in to help the roots to break down a bit, sort of clover. I think, is that right, Alan? So maybe I have to, I don't know how it's going to transition back again, but it's just enjoyable to see all the flowers and the insects and birds, and yeah, it's a nicer way to do it, I think. How it works, if you ask us in 2 or 3 years' time, I'll be able to answer that better, I think.
One of the beautiful thing about forbs, when we talk about herbal lays, these forbs tend to be very, very high in phytonutrient components, particularly medicinal compounds and even anti-parasitic compounds. So they help our animals to self-medicate in a very natural way. And they also help to further control internal and external parasites on our animals, whether it's cattle, sheep, or whatever. And even as we plant herbal lays and graze those adaptively, that also helps to stimulate the latent seed bank in the soil so that you then stimulate even more natural diversity. Sean, anything from your side on herbal lays?
Yeah, the first one I put in is just coming up 4 years old now. It's just about to go back into wheat this back end. So for the arable rotation, I only know half the answer because it'll be how the wheat follows it. It'll be the other half of the answer, and I won't know that till this time next year. On heavy clay here, I do find them hard to establish after the arable crop. It takes them a year. We have a year of not doing much, and then the second year is when they really get into their stride. And third and fourth year, that's when they really do some good. Stock can do well on them if you catch them at the right time. And with cows, because there's a bit of other stuff in apart from ryegrass, you can leave it a long time and the cows will still do well on it. It doesn't really get past its best. So from the stock side of it, I like them. I do like them. My mixes aren't as diverse as Ali's. He's a step ahead of me there. But even so, the stuff seems to do well on them. But like I say, it's the arable crop that follows them. Will be interesting to see how it does. And this time next year, I should have half an idea, hopefully.
Excellent. So the next question is, and again, Sean and Ali, both feel free to answer within your context, and also Luke and Kyle, feel free to jump in at any point. But in this one, it's moving to taller covers. Have you moved away from ryegrass dominant pastures? And if so, what mixes do you favor?
Do you want me to say what I think?
Sure.
Right. A lot of people chase drought tolerance in their mixes. But like I say, I'm on mostly blue clay. I have got a picture here. I'll just give everybody an idea of what I'm working with. So, right. That's what 80% of the farm is. It's blue or brown or orange clay with about 6 to 8 inches of topsoil on top. So drought is never a problem. How do I get that to the first up here? I never run out of moisture. Last year, everything kept growing, admittedly slower than normal, but there was never a time when the heat or the lack of moisture stopped things from growing. So I tend to quite like perennial ryegrass. I still do like it. I find the stock do well on it. I wouldn't want a field of all it, but I wouldn't want to move away from it either. It does a lot of jobs. It's one of the first grasses to set off in spring, and the first bite in spring's worth a lot more than the bite in the middle of summer when things are growing, everything's growing. So I do like it for that, and the sheep seem to winter well on it through as well. So I do put a bit of cocksfoot. I'm going to start adding a bit of timothy in. But none of them quite do the job that ryegrass does. So for me, I'm still keen on it. It's not a very fashionable answer, but it does work for me.
Excellent. Anything to add to that, Ali?
The predominantly grasses, grassland that I graze is permanent pasture, which hasn't really got much in the way of ryegrass in. What a little bit on the temporary grassland. I'm sort of pushing cocksfoot a bit, I think, to see where that goes, because it's got quite a good rooting depth, a big root ball. There was a farmer in the 1800s called Robert Elliott, who played around with much the same seed mixes that would play with herbal layers now. And that was one thing that he noted. There's a book of his, Clifton Park. I can't remember the full title, but that's Clifton Park was his farm. And it was something he noticed. If you put a temporary lay with a good amount of cocksfoot in, and he was ploughing back then because he didn't have the option direct drill, it was noticeable when you ploughed it out that the cocksfoot produced a better soil. I don't know whether he recorded much on what his grazing potential was. Performance-wise, it was similar to ryegrass, but sort of volume, but whether performance to growth was the same, I don't know. But that's I'm just playing with lots of different grasses, really.
Okay.
Alan,
Nice.
I might add something to that.
Yes, please.
And that kind of, particularly talking in one dominant species in a pasture or anything like that. I'm talking in perennial pastures here, but you made a mention in that dairy out east about how that long rest, that it's exclusion zone, how the plants look differently than the others in the other paddock there, even though they're the same species, they act differently. So you have to take into consideration as your management changes, species are going to change as well, because the biology is going to change as well and act differently. So plants are working in a way of succession. Some things are going to prosper, some things are going to tail off. And as your management changes, those species are going to act differently in your pastures as well. So if you might be heavily dominant in one species, it's there because of your current management or your past management, if you will. And as your management continues to change or be more adaptive, you might, and we're talking about diversity here, right? Diversity and rest and recovery. As that rest and recovery starts to improve and you manage that a little differently, some new species might come in and prosper then. So I wouldn't say, don't be adding in or sprinkling in more seeds or something like that for more diversity. That rest and recovery might encourage some new species to come in. So I would say take hold of that as it comes in. But, as your management changes, the biology changes and your plant species will change as well. So that's all I wanted to add, Alan.
Thank you very much. So the next question and comment is, I think the stocking density is too low on my farm. When the cattle move, there's a lot of standing grass that's gone to head. Is it very important that the grass is trampled sufficiently to get a good recovery? So first and foremost, if you've got grass at that stage where you have a lot going to head, then that's an ideal time to get a high degree of trample. And you control the stocking density. Now that's different than the stocking rate. Stocking rate are the number of livestock per acre or acres per head of livestock. But stock density is the total pounds of that livestock, sheep, cattle, on an acre. And And each one of you is in complete control of that. Particularly if you're using temporary fencing, polywire fencing, things like that. So you can effectively alter the stock density, the pounds per acre, and that's where you're going to get the degree of trample that you really need to get. So, if it's spring, and just talking about trample and those types of things, if it's spring and you're in the middle of spring flush, everything's pretty vegetative, that's not the time to focus on high trample. Okay, that's the time to look at other disruptions. But when you get on into the summer, longer into the growing season, and you've got a lot of grasses that are starting to go to head, that's when you really want to focus on higher stock density and trample effect. Now, beyond stock density, another thing that you can do to really significantly improve trample effect is paddock configuration. If you want a high degree of trample, build those paddocks long and narrow. So the cattle and or sheep have to move back and forth on a consistent basis. You can have the same stock density and the same acres under your paddock, but if you build it square, they're going to move in a circular pattern, and you're not going to have near the degree of trample impact versus building it long and narrow. So this is where paddock configuration as a disruption really comes into play and can be another excellent tool for you to use. Anything else to add to that, Luke or Kyle? Okay. The next question is this, and I'm going to again ask Sean and Allie to respond, and then I'm going to respond as well based on our experience, because we do have direct experience with what is being addressed in this question also. And the question is, how do you increase the diversity of pasture from a ryegrass clover base? How long does it take? So, Sean, Allie, any comments there? And then I'll address and ask Kyle and Luke if they have any comments as well. Sean, I'll start with you and then go to Allie.
Right. For me, on the better ground, it's all part of the arable rotation, grass and then into crops and out of it. So it happened with the planting, should I say, but I still managed to get good performance on the old perennial ryegrass white clover mixes. Other stuff does start coming through. There was a little bit of yarrow started appearing, and when I was about half the old mixes, half the new mixes, just moving cattle from one field to the other field, they would carry some of the seeds through with them, and that's made stuff start to appear. On native ground, do tend to get more herbs and that appear with the grazing. You can make stuff appear that way, but I wasn't, without it being introduced from elsewhere, I wasn't getting that much new stuff appearing on the white clover ryegrass layers that were planted, but they were only in for a year or two when they were out back to arable. So it's the planting the seeds has been how it's happened the fastest here. It didn't really answer the question, but that's what I found.
Anything to add to that, Allie?
I'm much the same here as well. I guess I said before, predominantly permanent pastures that haven't got a lot of ryegrass in anyway, and the temporary have been sown. So I don't really have a direct answer to that. Just sort of noticing again on the permanent pastures. My father always used to say, when he was young, he used to eat pig nuts, he used to take the root out and eat them. And sort of my lifetime, there was never much in the way of pig nut on the farm until last year. Like I say, there was getting about a 30-day rest, and the fells had loads of pig nut in, and the sheep went in and they were gone the next day. but it just shows that the seed is there and that they do come back if you give them a little bit of time. Whether on a pasture that's just ryegrass and I don't know what in micro, I don't know what the seed bank would be like. I don't really have any experience in that.
Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Ali. I've had quite a bit of experience with either going from a ryegrass clover base or another cool season grass like fescue or brome or whatever clover base. So we've dealt with a lot of cool season grass and clover based pastures that were fairly low diversity when we started. And even on both my personal farms in Mississippi and Alabama, I had a very similar situation as this. So there's two different tactics you can take. One is that you can, the first thing you absolutely want to do is to start implementing adaptive grazing with some planned purposeful disruptions, the rule of disruption. Now, once you've done that, then you can either seed in, plant some additional diversity, and that's perfectly okay to do. Just realize the cost that you're incurring there, okay, to do that. And never succumb to the temptation to then manage for only what you just planted. That's often what we want to do. And then all we're doing is going from one low diversity to another low diversity. We're going from what was there to what we planted and then managing only for what we planted. And really what we want to do is ongoing continued increase in diversity. So, but you can seed some initial diversity if you want to. However, without seeding any initial diversity, if this is where the rule of disruption and those various disruptions that I listed for you play an enormous role. We have found in this timetable that I'm getting ready to give you is pretty darn dependable. We have found that this timetable works over and over again in this type of scenario. So within about 3 years, okay, so 3 years. Within about 3 years, you will go from low diversity, a cool season grass, clover base, to having at least a dozen or more different plant species in that mix. And then it continues to increase after that. Again, remember that slide where I showed you the number of plant species that we've identified on our farm now? And I said, I've documented more than 150 different plant species. That very farm, I started in this type of situation, but instead of ryegrass, it was fescue and clover. So a cool season grass and a clover, and it was very much dominant fescue and clover. So we went from that to within, in that case, 3 years, we had several dozen new species growing without planting them. And in 5 years, we had over 100 species growing without planting them. So absolutely you can do it, but to really get good diversity, it's going to take about 3 years of intentional adaptive grazing. Anything else to add? Okay. Other questions? That's all the typed in questions. Do we have any additional questions that anybody would like to ask before Matt jumps back in and closes us out? Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thanks very much, Alan and Sean and Ali. That's been fantastic. And I think we've all thoroughly enjoyed the past hour and a bit. That's been much appreciated. And if you've been attending, you've got a bit of a flavour there, really, of some of what Understanding Ag do and kind of the perspectives they can bring. And I mean, Sean and Ali have been enjoying a bit of interaction with the guys now for a couple of years. So if this is the sort of things of interest, then please get in touch. But otherwise, we should be hosting another one of these in another month or so. So look out for that when it comes through. And thanks once again to you all for attending. Thanks for Alan, Ali, and Sean for leading the session. Much appreciated, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.